The bank closed on Tuesday. On Monday afternoon at 10 minutes past 4, with the shades down and the front door bolted, I counted $8,400 out of my drawer and into a leather satchel for a man who told me it was going to Des Moines for safekeeping. 5 weeks later, a state examiner stood up in the school gymnasium in front of every soul in Corliss, Iowa, and asked me whether I had signed the ticket for that money. I had. My name was on it in my own round hand, the hand my father paid $1 a week to have taught to me, and underneath my name was the name of the account that money went into, and it was my husband's. It did not begin that way at all. It began with a passbook and a man who could not hear thunder, and if you will sit with me a while, I will tell you the whole of it, the way it happened and in the order it happened. Because the order is the thing that nearly cost us everything.
Before we go on, tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight. It always amazes me how far these stories travel, and I like to think of you out there, in a kitchen, or a truck, or a dark bedroom with the light off. Now settle in. My name is Hattie Vance, and in the winter of 1932, I was 27 years old, and I was the second teller at the Farmers and Merchants Bank of Corliss. There were only 2 of us behind the cages, so second teller meant I was the one who was not Wendell Prine, and Wendell Prine did not let anybody forget it. Still, it was a good place. It was warm. It smelled of floor wax and ink and the coal smoke that came up through the register by the door, and every morning at 5 minutes to 9, I stood at my window and lined up my stamps in a row, the date stamp and the paid stamp, and the little one that said Farmers and Merchants Bank, Corliss, Iowa, and I straightened them until the edges made one straight line. Mr. Prine used to say I fussed. Maybe I did. My mother had been dead 11 years by then, and I think the fussing was something I did with my hands so I would not think about how much of the day was left. The building itself was a narrow brick front on Sycamore Street with a stone step worn into a shallow dish in the middle from 40 years of boots. Inside, there were the 2 teller cages with their brass grills, and behind them a low oak rail, and behind the rail, 2 desks. The far desk belonged to Josiah Finn, who kept the books and was 68 years old and had been keeping books in that room since before the electric lights went in. The near desk belonged to Junius Lofton, the president, and behind Mr. Lofton's desk was a door with frosted glass that said Private, and in that room he had a roll-top desk, a coat tree, and a photograph of himself shaking hands with a man from the State Banking Association in Des Moines. I had been in that room perhaps 6 times in 5 years. The vault was in the back, and it was not much of a vault, only a steel door in a brick closet with the year 1898 painted on it in gold. But it was the most serious thing in the county. When you swung that door, you felt the weight of it come around on the hinges like a living thing leaning against your hand. The first week I worked there, Mr. Lofton walked me back to it and said, "Mrs. Vance, a bank is not money. A bank is the belief that the money is here. You are in the belief business." Then he laughed at his own line, the way he laughed at all his own lines, with his chin up and his hand flat on his vest. I liked him then. I want you to understand that, because if I make him a devil from the start, you will not believe the rest of it, and the rest of it is true to the way people are. Junius Lofton was 51 that winter, a broad, pink, well-kept man with white hair combed straight back and a gold watch chain, and he knew every name in that town and the name of every one of their people back 2 generations. When the Hodel boy drowned in the mill race, he carried one corner of the casket. When the Methodist parsonage roof went in a hailstorm, he wrote the check for the shingles himself and told the preacher not to say so from the pulpit, which meant, of course, that the preacher said so from the pulpit. He remembered that my mother had been sick a long time,
and he never once let a year go by without asking after my father by name. My father was Amos Kell. He had been a drayman in Corliss for 31 years, hauling coal and trunks and lumber, and once, in the flu year, hauling more than I care to put words around. In 1926, a wagon tongue came back on him in a runaway and took most of the hearing out of his left ear. And by 1932, the right ear had gone soft with age, and he heard the world the way you hear a conversation in the next room. He would not use a horn. He said the horn made him look like an invalid, and he would rather look like a man who did not care to talk. So he watched your mouth when you spoke, and he answered a beat late, and people who did not know him thought he was slow. He was not slow. He was the only man I ever knew who could look at a stacked wagon and tell you what it weighed inside, 40 pounds. He had two things in the world besides me. The first was the little white house on Vine Street with the lilac that never bloomed right. The second was his passbook. I ought to tell you about the passbook because it runs through this whole story like a wire through a fence. It was a small book, about the size of a man's palm, with a stiff, dark green cover gone soft at the corners, and inside were the ruled columns where the teller wrote the date and the deposit and the new balance and stamped it. My father's first entry was made in the year 1901, and it was for $4.60. When I started at the bank, he brought it to my window on purpose, on my first day, in front of everybody, and slid it under the grill and said, loud, the way deaf men are loud, "Well, ma'am, I'd like to make a deposit." And I said, "Certainly, sir," and my hand shook so I nearly could not work the stamp. There were people in line behind him, and every one of them was smiling. He got that book back and looked at the new line in my writing for a long moment, and then he put it in his inside coat pocket and buttoned the coat over it. And that is where it lived for the next 5 years. By that winter, the book showed a little more than $900. 31 years of hauling other people's belongings and $900, and he was as proud of it as a man with a section of bottom land. He was going to buy me and Rand a piece of ground out past the fairgrounds, and he had already picked which piece. Rand is my husband, Rand Vance, and if you have ever loved a quiet man, you know already how it went. He worked the elevator at the end of Sycamore where the Rock Island spur came in, and in a good fall he worked 18 hours a day and came home white to the eyebrows with dust. And in a bad one he worked 4 days a week and sat on the back step with his hands hanging down between his knees, looking at the yard. 1932 was a bad one. Corn was eating money by then. A man would haul in a load and stand at the scale and figure it out and find that the load had cost him more to raise than the check was worth. And then he would say something mild about the weather and drive home. And that was the whole conversation. And it happened 40 times a day. We had one child. Bertie was 6 that winter, and she had my mother's straight dark hair and Rand's slow way of looking at a thing before she said anything about it. She had been sick in the fall, the kind of sick that starts as a cold and settles into the chest and stays. And there had been a night in October when Dr. Wimple stood in our front room at 2 in the morning with his sleeves rolled and told us that if she was not better by Friday, he wanted her in the county hospital at Ottumwa. She was better by Friday. But there had been a bill, and the bill was $38, and we did not have $38, and that is a fact that comes back into this story with a knife in its hand. So hold on to it. Our mornings were a good machine. I was up at 5:30 and had the stove going and coffee on before I woke either of them, and Rand came down and ate standing at the window the way he always did. And Bertie came down last with her stockings in her hand and sat on the bottom step to put them on. I combed her hair at the kitchen table with the comb in one hand and my coffee in the other. At 7:30, Rand went one way up Sycamore, and I went the other, and at the corner by the Rexall, he would turn around and walk backward 3 or 4 steps and lift his hand, and I would lift mine, and then we both went on to work. 5 years he did that. I did not know it was the kind of thing you would give a year of your life to have back. At the bank, the morning had its own order. Josiah Finn was always there first with his green eye shade already on and his coffee cooling on the corner of the blotter where it would sit untasted until 11. Mr. Prine came in at 10 till and hung his coat with a particular flick of the shoulders. I took my cash drawer out of the vault and counted it into the till, 1s and 5s and 10s in their clips, and I signed the count sheet, and Mr. Prine signed under it, and Mr. Lofton came in at 9:05 with the cold still on his overcoat and said good morning to the room like a man greeting a crowd from a platform. And then the doors opened and Corliss came in. You learn a town from behind a teller's grill the way a doctor learns it, which is to say, you learn the part people would rather you did not. I knew who was $10 from the end of the world and smiling about the weather. I knew which farmer had started paying his help in scrip on the store account. I knew that the widow Eula Sharp kept her burial money in cash in a coffee can and came in twice a year to trade the small bills for a 50 because the 50 took up less room in the can. I knew that Foy Tandy, who owned the lumberyard and sat on our board, ran his personal account like a boy runs a slingshot, and that Mr. Lofton covered him and never once let the overdraft appear anywhere I could see it. And I knew, that winter, that the bank was afraid. You could see it in 100 small ways if you stood where I stood. Mr. Lofton had begun to come out of the private office when a farmer came in to talk about a note, and to take him by the elbow and walk him back inside instead of talking at the rail. Josiah Finn had stopped humming. Twice in January, Mr. Prine locked the vault at 4 and then went back and opened it again at 9:30 and stood in front of it for a while with the door swung wide and did not put anything in and did not take anything out that I could see. 3 banks had already gone down that winter within 60 miles of us. The Sentinel printed the closings in the same column as the livestock prices, in the same size type, the way a country paper will set the end of the world next to the price of a hog. First, the farmer's savings at Delphi. Then the State Bank at Marne. Then, on the 22nd of January, the bank at Vantage, which was the county seat and had a marble floor. And when that one went, it went with a line of people standing in the snow all the way past the harness shop. And a man from Vantage came into our lobby the next morning and stood in the middle of the floor with his hat in his hands and did not go to either window. Just stood there looking at our vault door until Mr. Lofton came out and shook his hand and talked to him in that low, warm voice and walked him to the door. After the man left, Mr. Lofton stood by my cage for a minute, watching the street through the front glass. "They come to look at the door," he said. "They can't read a balance sheet, so they come and look at the door and see if it's still on the hinges." "Is it?" I said. I meant it lightly. I want to be honest with you. I meant it lightly, and I have thought about that ever since. He turned and looked at me. It was only a second, and his face did not change at all. But the second was one beat too long, and I felt it go by like a draft under a door. "Mrs. Vance," he said, "you and I are the 2 people in this county who never have to ask that question." And he smiled and rapped his knuckles twice on the sill of my cage and went back into the private office and shut the frosted door. I stamped the rest of the morning's tickets and I put that beat away somewhere in the back of my mind where I put things I do not intend to look at. And it stayed there 4 weeks, until the night it came out and stood in front of me with its hat off. The first week of February, the weather turned and stayed turned. It snowed on a Tuesday, and then it froze, and after that the snow did not melt. It only got dirtier, until the banks along Sycamore Street were the color of a coal bucket, and the ruts in the road were hard as iron and rang under a wheel. It was the kind of cold that gets into a building and lives there. Josiah Fenn kept his overcoat on until noon. I wore my mother's gray wool at my window with the cuffs turned back so I could count. That was the week Mr. Lofton began asking me to stay. It came so easy the first time that I did not even take it home with me. It was a Friday, and at 4 o'clock he came out of the private office with his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and stood at the rail and said, "Mrs. Vance, I would be obliged if you could give me an hour after we close. There's a reconciliation the examiners will want in April, and I would rather not put it on Josiah. He's slower than he was. Would that be a hardship at home?" I said it would not. Rand had the late shift at the elevator that month anyway, and Bertie ate supper at my father's on those nights, and my father liked nothing better than to feed her creamed peas and tell her lies about the year the river froze so hard they drove a coal wagon over it. So I stayed. And what he had me do that first Friday was the plainest work in the world. He set me at Josiah's desk with a ledger and a stack of debit slips and had me read out amounts while he checked them against a column. And when we came to the bottom of a page, he would say, "Again, please," and I would read it again. He was pleasant. He made coffee on the little gas ring in the private office and brought me a cup, and did not put himself on the other side of the desk in a way that would have made me uncomfortable. At 5:30 he said, "That's enough. You've a family." And he walked me to the door and stood there with his hand on the light switch while I went down the stone step, and he said good night, and the lock turned behind me. I stayed 6 more times in February. I want to be plain about that too. I was not tricked into that room. I went of my own feet, and part of why I went is that after 5 years at the second window, a woman gets tired of being the one who is not window prime. And when the president of the bank puts a ledger in front of you and says he would rather have your eyes on it than anybody's, it is a warm thing, and I let it warm me. By the third night, the work had changed a little. He had me copying. There was a batch of drafts that had gone through in December with the amounts written in a cramped hand that he said the state boys would squint at, and he wanted them written out fair on new tickets, the old ones pinned behind. "Write them the way you write," he said. "Your 4s are the only honest 4s in this county." I laughed at that. I copied maybe 40 tickets across 2 nights, and I initialed each one in the corner as a copy, and he watched me do it and then squared the stack and put it in the drawer of the roll-top desk and turned the little key. Only 40 tickets. I had put my hand on 40 pieces of paper that I did not write the first time. Sit with that a minute, because I have sat with it for years. The other thing that happened in February was the man from Ottumwa. He came in on a Wednesday about 2, and he was not from around there. You could tell before he opened his mouth by the cut of the overcoat, which was good, and by the way he stood in the middle of the lobby and looked up at the ceiling as if he were pricing the plaster. He was maybe 40, dark, clean-shaven, and when he smiled at me, there was a gold tooth up on the left side that caught the window light. "Mr. Lofton in? May I say who's calling?" "Dorset," he said. "He'll know." Mr. Lofton came out fast. That is the part I remember. In 5 years, I had never seen that man hurry across his own lobby, and he came across it that day with his hand already out, and he took Dorset by the elbow the way he took the farmers who wanted to talk about their notes, and he walked him into the private office and shut the frosted door. and I heard the bolt go over. There was a bolt on that door. I had worked there 5 years, and I had never once heard it thrown. They were in there 50 minutes. When Dorset came out, he stopped at my cage, which he had no reason to do, and he looked at my nameplate. "Vance," he said. "Any relation to the Vance out at the elevator?" "My husband." "Big fellow. Hard of hearing, isn't he?" "That's his father you're thinking of," I said, though it was not, and I do not know to this day why I said it. Something in me stood up and put its hand on the door. "Was there something I could do for you?" "Not a thing in the world, ma'am." The gold tooth again. He put 2 fingers to his hat brim and went out, and the cold came in around him while the door was open, and I stood there with my hands flat on the counter. That night, I asked Rand if he knew a man named Dorset. He was at the table with his boots off, working liniment into his shoulder, and he had to ask me to say it twice. And then he said no. He said it easy. He said, "Should I?" And I said, "No, nobody, a customer." And I got up and took the plates. Now I have to tell you about the association. And I have to do it carefully, because everything that came after hangs on this one thread. In Corliss, there was a burial association. It was properly the Corliss Working Men's Benevolent and Burial Association, and it had been going since 1894. And there was hardly a man in that town who worked with his hands who did not belong to it. You paid 25 cents a week. In return, when you died, the association buried you decently and put a stone up and gave your widow $100 in her hand inside of a week, which in 1932 was the difference between a widow keeping her house and a widow moving in with a daughter-in-law who did not want her. 25 cents a week does not sound like much, but there were 400 and some members, and the thing had been running 38 years, and a fund like that grows the way a hedge grows, slow and then all at once. That winter, the association's account at our bank stood at $8,411.16. My father had paid into it since he was 19 years old. So had every drayman and section hand and elevator man and hired girl's husband in that town. It was not the bank's money, and it was not the county's money. It was the last thing between 400 families and the potter's field. And everybody in Corliss knew the figure the way they knew the church bell, because it was read out loud every January at the association's annual meeting in the hall over the harness shop. The treasurer of the association was Orrin Pike. I have to tell you about him, too, and this is harder. Orrin Pike was 63, a little dry stick of a man with spectacles mended at the hinge with copper wire, and he had taught the 8th grade in Corliss for 22 years before his chest went bad and he took over the feed store scales. He taught me arithmetic. He is the reason I can add a column upside down and backward, which is a teller's whole trade. And when the second window came open at the bank in 1927, it was Orrin Pike who walked into Junius Lofton's office without being asked and told him that Amos Kell's girl could figure rings around any man he was considering. He got me that job. He came to my wedding. He gave Bertie a slate for her 5th birthday, with her name already scratched on it in his fine, square hand. On the 11th of February, Orrin Pike came into the bank at 10 in the morning, which was not one of his days. He did not come to my window. He stood at the rail with his hat in his hands and asked Josiah Fenn if he might see the signature card on the association account. Josiah looked up over the eye shade and said, "Certainly, Orrin." And then Mr. Lofton's door opened before Josiah had got the drawer out, and Mr. Lofton came across the room saying, "Orrin!" "Come in here where it's warm," and took his elbow, and the frosted door closed. They were in there 20 minutes. Nobody threw the bolt that time. I could hear Mr. Lofton's voice going along steady and low, the way you talk to a horse you are shoeing. And I could hear Orrin Pike say one thing loud, one time. And the one thing was, and I am giving it to you exactly, that is not what I signed. Then the door opened, and Orrin Pike came out. I have seen men come out of a doctor's office. I have seen a man come out of the shed where they had laid his brother after the elevator fell on him. Orrin Pike came out of that office with his face the color of a wet newspaper, and his mouth working like he was trying to swallow something dry. And he walked straight past the rail, and I said, "Mr. Pike?" And he did not turn his hand. He got the door open on the second try. He left his hat on the chair by the rail. I brought the hat around the end of the counter and got to the step with it and called down the sidewalk after him, and he was already at the corner, going away fast in that stiff old man's hurry, and he never looked back. I stood there in the cold with his hat in my hands. When I came in, Mr. Lofton was standing at the rail waiting for me. He looked at the hat and he looked at me, and he smiled the way you smile at a funeral. "His boy," he said, "down in Missouri. Bad business, and Orrin can't help him, and it eats him." He shook his head slowly. "Set it there, he'll be back for it. And Mrs. Vance, if he says anything odd to you, anything at all, I take it kindly if you tell me first. He's not himself. I'd hate for it to get around town and shame him." "Yes, sir," I said. "Do you hear what I did there?" He built the box and I stepped into it and pulled the lid down after myself and said, "Yes, sir." Not because I was a fool, because a man I respected told me a sad story about a sick son and asked me to protect an old teacher's dignity. And I was proud to be asked. Orrin Pike did not come back for the hat. It sat on that chair 11 days. The last thing that happened before the Monday I did not even count as a thing at the time. It was the 20th of February, a Saturday, half-day, and I was closing out my drawer when Josiah Fenn came around the end of the counter with the note file under his arm and stood there a minute the way an old man does when he is deciding whether to say something. "Hattie," he said. He was the only one there who called me by my name. "That $50 note of your husband's, the one from October." Something turned over in me. "What about it?" "It's not in the file." He said it flat, the way he said everything, but his thumb was going back and forth on the corner of the folder. "It's on the books. I've got it posted. $50, Rand Vance, dated the 11th of October, 90 days. But the paper's not in the file, and I've looked twice." "Mr. Lofton handled it himself," I said. "In the office. Rand went in and came out and never said a word about it except that it was done." "I know he did." Josiah looked at the front window a while. "Well, it'll be in his desk. It'd be in his desk, of course." "Josiah, I've kept books 40 years, he said. "I don't like paper I can't put my hand on. That's all it is." And he went and got his coat. I walked home along Sycamore with my collar up. The elevator was running late, and I could hear the leg belt from 3 blocks off, that steady rattling churn that was the sound of the whole town making its living. And I thought about a $50 note in a locked drawer, and about 40 tickets in my own handwriting in the same locked drawer. And then I stopped thinking about it, because Bertie was at the window of my father's house, with her hands cupped against the glass, looking for me. And my father was behind her with a dish towel over his shoulder, and the lamp was lit. And I did not yet know that I was looking at the last ordinary Saturday of my life. The 29th of February, 1932, was a Monday. It was a leap day, and there had been a piece in the Sentinel that week about how a child born on that date only has a proper birthday once in 4 years, and Bertie had asked me at breakfast whether that meant such a child stayed the same age, and my father said yes, and she believed him until Thursday. The day itself was slow, cold and bright, the sun with no heat in it, the kind of light that makes a room look poorer than it is. We took in 11 deposits, and 4 of them were under $2, and we paid out a good deal more than we took in, which had been true for 6 weeks. At 3 o'clock, Wendell Prine counted out and went home. I remember standing at my cage with my hands still and watching him wind his muffler at the coat tree, because Wendell Prine had not left before 4 o'clock a single day in 5 years, and because Mr. Lofton had come out and said in front of me, "Go on home, Wendell. Your wife's people are in from Vantage, aren't they?" And Wendell had not answered that, had only pulled the muffler tight and gone out. At 10 minutes to 4, Mr. Lofton lowered the shades himself. He did that some days when the sun came around the front of the building in the late afternoon and laid a glare on the counter. So it was not the shades that put the cold finger on the back of my neck. It was that he did it in the order he did it. Front first, then the 2 on the street side, then the little one on the alley door glass, which never got any sun at all in February and had not been lowered once that winter. "Mrs. Vance," he said, "I'll need you a half hour tonight. Then I'll run you home in the car. It's too cold to walk." "I don't mind walking, Mr. Lofton." "I'll run you home," he said. He locked the front door at 4 and turned the sign, and he went into the private office, and when he came back, he had a leather satchel in his hand. It was a good satchel, the kind a doctor carries, with 2 brass buckles, and it was empty enough that it had lost its shape and hung slack from his fist. He set it on my counter. "$8,400, he said, "out of your drawer and the reserve. I'd like you to count it, and then I'd like you to count it again, and I want you to take your time about it. There's no hurry at all." I asked the question. I want you to know I asked it. My voice came out ordinary. "May I ask what it's for?" And here is where a man shows you how well he knows you. He did not tell me to mind my window. He did not go pink and puff himself up. He put both hands on the counter and leaned in a little and dropped his voice to the register of a man letting you inside the door. "You know what's coming in April," he said. "The examiners. You know what happened at Vantage and Marne and Delphi. Now we are sound. I want you to hear me say that. This bank is sound. But sound is not the same as liquid. And the trust funds we hold, the ones that are not ours, that belong to people who cannot afford 1 hour of doubt, those I am not going to leave sitting in a country vault where some clerk from Des Moines can tie them up in a receivership for 18 months while widows go hungry. This goes to a correspondent house. It sits in a name where nobody can freeze it, and when the weather clears, it comes home. And not one soul in this town ever has to know his burial money spent 3 weeks in Ottumwa. Ottumwa. He said Ottumwa. He had said Des Moines to me the first time, on the Friday, when he said the examiners would want a reconciliation, and he said Ottumwa now, and both of those cities were in the same sentence in my head for about a second and a half before I let them go, because he had also said something else in that speech, and it went through me like a nail. Burial money. "That's the associations," I said. "That is the associations," he agreed. "And Orrin Pike has known about it since the 11th of this month. And he did not like it, and I did not care whether he liked it, and I will tell you what I told him. His job is to hold that money. My job is to make sure there is money for him to hold. Those are two different jobs, Mrs. Vance, and only one of us can do mine." Then he straightened up and took his hands off my counter and said in his ordinary voice, "8,400. Take your time." And I counted it. I want to tell you it took me a long time to decide. It did not. It took me the length of a breath. He was the president of the bank, and he had said the words trust funds and widows, and I was 27 years old, and I had been raised to believe that a woman who asked a second question after she had been given an answer was rude, and every last one of those things was in the room with me. And I opened my drawer. I counted it in packets of 500, ones and fives and tens, and a great deal in 20s, and the reserve out of the vault in 50s. And when I had it laid out on the counter in rows, it did not look like $8,000. Money never does. It looked like the bottom of a stove, gray and green and used, and it smelled the way money smells, like old hands. It came to 8,400 exactly. I counted it again, and it came to 8,400 again. And my hands were steady the whole time, and I have thought about that too over the years. My hands were steady. He had a ticket ready. It was a debit ticket, our regular form, and it was already made out in his hand, and he set it down turned toward me with the top half under the corner of the blotter, the way a man sets down a paper he has been reading, without any performance about it at all. What I could see was the amount, 8,400 and no cents, and the date, and the line for the counting teller. "Your initials will do," he said. "I'd rather it was the whole name. The state boys are children about initials." I signed my whole name, Hattie Kell Vance, in the round hand my father paid $1 a week for. He buckled the satchel. He put on his overcoat and his hat, and took the satchel and told me to get my coat, and I said I truly would rather walk. And this time he did not argue. He was already looking at the alley door. As I went out the front, I heard him throw the bolt behind me, and when I got to the corner of Sycamore and 3rd, I looked back down the alley the way you look at a thing you have already told yourself you are not looking at. And there was an automobile standing at the alley door with its engine going and its lamps off. And it was a dark Studebaker sedan, and it was not from Corliss, because I knew every car in Corliss. Here is the piece of it that got into my chest and sat there all that night. The train to Des Moines left Corliss at 3:40 in the afternoon. There was no other. To Ottumwa, you could go at 6:10 in the morning, or you could drive it, 61 miles of gravel with 2 river bridges in the dark in February. A bank in Ottumwa would not open its doors until 9 the next morning, no matter who stood on the step. So there was no earthly reason for that money to leave our vault that night. If it was going to a correspondent house, it could have gone Tuesday morning in daylight with a receipt written out. There was no reason to move it at 10 minutes past 4 with the shades down and a strange car in the alley with its lamps off. I lay awake and I worked at it the way you work at a splinter. And by 2 in the morning I had it explained. He was afraid of a run. He wanted the trust money out of the building before some rumor started at the barber shop on Tuesday morning. He was sending it with a man he trusted, so it would be in Ottumwa when the doors opened. That was all. That was all, and I said it over twice. And I got up and went in and put my hand on Bertie's back to feel her breathing the way I had done every night since October. And I went back to bed and slept 2 hours. I have had a good many years to wonder about the woman who lay in that bed and talked herself down. I do not think she was stupid. I think she knew, the way you know a thing in the meat of your arms before your mind will sign for it. And I think what she wanted was one more night of the life she had. And she paid for it with everything. Tuesday morning, the 1st of March, I got up at 5:30 and had the stove going and the coffee on, and I combed Bertie's hair at the kitchen table, and Rand ate standing at the window, and at the corner by the Rexall, he turned around and walked backward and lifted his hand, and I lifted mine. I came down Sycamore at 20 minutes to 9, and I saw the men. There were maybe 15 of them in front of the bank, and more coming, and they were not standing in a line, they were standing in a clot. And when men stand like that in a small town at that hour, it means something has happened in a building. Somebody had already shoveled the step. I remember that. Somebody had shoveled our step out of 38 years of habit, and then read what was tacked to the door. It was a card, white, about the size of 2 envelopes, and it said that this bank was in the hands of the Superintendent of Banking of the state of Iowa, and it was signed by a deputy examiner whose name I did not know, and underneath, somebody had already written something in pencil across the bottom, which the sheriff scraped off with his knife at 9 o'clock. The frosted glass was dark. Mr. Lofton's Buick was not at the curb, and it was never at the curb again. I got through them because they made a place for me. That is the part that hurts. They stood back and let the teller through, and a man named Clyde Bushong, who hauled milk, put his hand on my sleeve and said, "Hattie, they'll open, won't they? They'll open by noon." And I said, "I don't know, Clyde." And he said, "But you'd know. Wouldn't you know?" I had my key in my hand. I stood on the step with my key in my hand and my back to 40 men, and I could not make myself put it in the lock. And I do not know how long I stood there. And then Josiah Fenn's voice came from the side, from the alley, saying, "Hattie, come around this way." He was at the alley door, and he had his hat on, and he had been crying. An old man crying in the cold with his eye shade still in his coat pocket. He got the door open and got me inside and shut it. The lobby was dark and it was already cold, and it smelled the way it always smelled, wax and ink and coal smoke. And the ordinariness of that smell in that room at that moment was the worst thing I had felt in my life up to then. "He's gone," Josiah said. "Junius." 7 o'clock this morning, the examiner came up from Vantage, and there's another one on the way from Des Moines. And the wire says Junius took the sleeper out of Ottumwa at 11 last night. He was not looking at me. He was looking at the vault door, which stood open, which it should not have at that hour. Wendell's out at his sister's and won't come in. The examiner's in the office now with the note case. Josiah. My mouth was dry as flour. The association account. And the old man turned around and looked at me for the first time. And I saw that he already knew what I had done, and that he had not decided yet whether he was going to help me or hand me over. $8,411.16, he said. Debited yesterday afternoon at 4:20. Balance is $11.16. He waited a beat. "There's a ticket for it in the cage drawer, Hattie. It's got your whole name on it, and it's the only signature on the paper." The floor did not go out from under me. I want to be accurate. What happened was that my ears began to ring, one long high note, and the room got very far away and very small and bright, the way a room looks through the wrong end of a spyglass. And I heard myself say from somewhere out in the street, "He told me it was going to a correspondent house." "I know he did," said Josiah Fenn, "because he told me the same thing in 1929, and it was $400 then, and it came back inside of a week. And I have never told a living soul that, and I am going to be paying for it the rest of my life." Through the wall we could hear the crowd. It had that low mumbling sound a crowd has before it decides what it is, And then over the top of it, out on Sycamore, clear as a bell through the brick, I heard my father's voice, loud the way deaf men are loud, asking somebody where his girl was, and telling them he had his book right here, and that his girl would fix it. I went out the front door to my father because there was nothing else a person could do. The crowd had grown. There were women in it now, and a boy up on the fender of Tandy's truck, and the sound had changed from mumbling to that flat hard talk men use when they are deciding to be angry together. My father was in the middle of it with his coat unbuttoned and his hat pushed back, and he had the passbook out of his inside pocket, and he was holding it up in his fist, not shaking it at anybody, just holding it up the way you hold up a ticket at a gate. "There she is," he said. "There, now." 40 faces turned around. "Papa, come inside. They're saying the doors are shut." He had to read my mouth, and it made him lean in, and it made everything he said sound like a challenge when it was only a deaf man asking. "I told them you'd know when they open. Tell them." I could smell the wet wool of his coat. Behind me, somebody said, "Let her talk," and somebody else said, "She was in there last night. My boy seen the lights." That was the first time I heard it said out loud. 19 hours after I did it. That is how fast a small town's air moves. "Papa," I put both my hands over his fist and the passbook in it. "Come inside with me." And he looked at my face, and my father was not a slow man, I told you that. He read my face the way he read a stacked wagon, and I watched him figure the weight of it. And he let me take his arm, and we went around by the alley with the whole street watching, and Josiah Finn shut the door on us. I told him in the dark lobby standing by the rail. I did not sit him down. I told him what I had counted, and what I had been told, and what I had signed. And he stood there with his hat in his hand and the passbook in the other, and he did not say one word until I was done. Then he said, "Whose name?" "They haven't told me the account it went to." "Whose name is on the ticket, Hattie?" "Mine," I said. My father was 64 years old. He put the passbook back in his inside coat pocket and buttoned the coat over it, the way he had done 10,000 times, and he said, "Well, then we'll want a lawyer before you say anything else to anybody, and we haven't got money for a lawyer, and that's the size of it." He looked around the dark lobby, at the vault standing open, at the 2 cages, at the chair by the rail where Orrin Pike's hat had sat 11 days. 31 years I hauled for this town," he said. "I never once left a load where I couldn't see it." The deputy examiner's name was Hollis Crane, and he came out of the private office at 9:20 with his coat off and his sleeves buttoned and the note case under his arm. And he was about 35, and he had the manner of a man who has walked into a great many rooms where everybody was lying to him and has stopped taking it personally. He asked my father to wait by the rail. He took me into the private office and left the frosted door standing open, which I understood later was a kindness and a precaution both. And he put a chair for me and sat down behind Junius Lofton's roll-top desk, which had been jimmied open with a screwdriver. And the little key was gone, and the drawer was empty except for a rubber band and a box of pen nibs. "Mrs. Vance," he said, "I'm going to show you a ticket, and I'm going to ask you to tell me about it. And before I do that, I am obliged to tell you that whatever you say to me goes into my report, and my report goes to the county attorney." "I understand." "Do you want your husband here? Or your father?" "I want to see the ticket," I said. He laid it on the blotter face up and turned it toward me, the whole of it, the top half that had been under the corner of the blotter the night before. The bottom half I knew by heart. $8,400 and no cents. the 29th of February. Counting teller, Hattie Vance, in my round hand. The top half said, transfer, per instruction of the Depositor Association, to the Second National Bank of Ottumwa, Iowa, for credit of the account of R. Vance, Corliss, Iowa. There is a thing that happens in your body that I had heard about and did not believe in until that morning. My vision went narrow at the edges, like a lamp turned down, and my hearing came back very sharp and very close, so that I could hear the examiner's watch. Something hot and metal came up the back of my throat, and I sat there and swallowed it down twice. My hands were flat on my knees, and I could see them, and they were not shaking, and that struck me as obscene. R. Vance, I said. Your husband's name is Rand Vance. My husband loads corn, I said. My husband has never been in Ottumwa but once in his life, and that was in October when our girl was sick. And he could not tell you what a signature card is. And if you put $8,000 on this desk in front of him, he would ask you whose it was so he could carry it back to them. Mrs. Vance, he has never had $80 all at one time. My voice was going up and I heard it, and I could not get hold of it. He signed a note for $50 in October to pay a doctor, and he was ashamed of it for a month. And I stopped, because I heard what I had said, and so did Hollis Crane, and he sat forward. He signed a note, he said. Where is it? It isn't in the file, I said. Josiah Fenn told me on Saturday that it isn't in the file. Hollis Crane wrote that down. He wrote it down without any expression at all, and then he set his pen on the blotter and looked at me for a while. Mrs. Vance, I'm going to tell you what I have got, because you are going to hear a version of it in the street by dinner time, and the street's version will be worse. At 6 minutes after 9 this morning, the Second National Bank of Ottumwa confirmed by telephone that they hold a new account opened yesterday, the 29th, in the name of R. Vance of Corliss, with a deposit made this morning of $8,400 in currency. The card was signed at their counter. The man who signed it gave your husband's name, your husband's street, and your husband's place of employment. Yesterday, I said. The account was opened yesterday, before I counted the money. He stopped, and I want you to know that it was not a lawyer who caught that, and it was not the county attorney. It was a teller in a wool dress with her whole life coming apart on the other side of a desk. Because a teller is a person who has spent 5 years noticing that a date is either right or it is not. Say that again, said Hollis Crane. The bank in Ottumwa closes at 3. Mr. Lofton lowered the shades here at 10 minutes to 4, and I counted that money after that. If somebody opened an account in my husband's name at a bank in Ottumwa yesterday, they did it while my husband was standing on the elevator floor in front of 9 men and while that money was still in my drawer. Whoever it was not him, and whoever it was knew the day before that there would be $8,400 to put in it. Hollis Crane picked his pen back up. Where was your husband yesterday afternoon? At the elevator. Ask anybody. I will, he said. Mrs. Vance, sit down, please. I have one more. I had not known I had stood up. He took a folder out of the note case and slid out a sheet. And it was association letterhead, the old kind with the 2 clasped hands printed at the top. And it was a letter of instruction dated the 25th of February, authorizing the transfer of the association's deposit to a correspondent institution at the discretion of the president of the Farmers and Merchants Bank. And it was signed at the bottom in a fine square hand I had been looking at since I was 13 years old. Orrin Pike, Treasurer. I said, No. You know the signature. He taught me to write, I said. That's his hand, No. He came in here on the 11th and asked to see the signature card, and he came out of that office looking like a man who'd been told his sentence, and he said out loud, "That is not what I signed." And then I stopped for the second time in 10 minutes, and this time it was worse. And I have never in my life had a thought arrive the way that one arrived. 40 tickets. "Write them the way you write," he had said. "Your fours are the only honest fours in this county." "Mr. Crane," I said, "in February at night, after hours, Mr. Lofton had me copy out about 40 December drafts onto fresh tickets. He said the originals were in a cramped hand and the examiners would squint at them. I initialed each one as a copy. He put them in that drawer." I pointed at the jimmied roll top, at the rubber band and the box of nibs. "That drawer." Hollis Crane looked at the drawer a long moment. "Mrs. Vance," he said, "was one of those tickets an interest credit to the Burial Association?" "I don't know. I read the amounts, I didn't read the accounts. He told me to take my time about the figures." My mouth was so dry the words came apart. "I didn't read the accounts." "Then I will tell you what I think you did," he said, and he said it without any cruelty in it, which somehow made it worse. "I think you spent 2 nights in February writing a paper record in a clean hand, for a man who intended it to be found. And I think whatever was in that drawer has been in a stove since Sunday, and what is left in this bank is what he chose to leave. And every piece of it that touches this fund has got either your handwriting on it or your husband's name on it." Outside, through the frosted glass and the brick, the crowd made a sound like a wave taking gravel. They opened the doors at 11. Not the bank. The bank never opened again. But the deputy examiner had the sheriff bring a table out onto the step, and he stood on the step in the cold in his shirt sleeves and read a statement to the town. He said that the institution was in the hands of the superintendent. He said that a receiver would be appointed. He said that depositors would be paid a dividend in the fullness of the process, and that he could not say what that dividend would be, and that any man who told them different was guessing. Then Clyde Bushong, who hauled milk, called out from the middle of the crowd and asked about the burial money. I was standing inside the front window with my hand on the shade cord. I could see the backs of their heads and the steam of their breath. Hollis Crane did not lie to them. I will give him that until the day I die. He said that the association's deposit had been transferred out on the 29th of February to an account in Ottumwa, that the transfer was under investigation, and that at present that money was not in the possession of this bank or the superintendent. The sound the crowd made then was not a shout. It was a kind of groan. 400 years of 25 cents a week going out of 100 chests at once. And then it broke up into individual voices, and one of the voices, I never did learn whose, said clear and loud, "Whose account in Ottumwa?" And Hollis Crane, who had no reason on God's earth to protect me, and every reason in his official soul not to, said, "That is under investigation." He bought me 9 hours. By 8 o'clock that evening, a man named Del Yeager, who drove for the produce house, had been to Ottumwa and back, and had stood in the Corliss Hotel lobby and told 9 men what the name on the account was. And by 9 o'clock, somebody had put a rock through the front window of my father's house on Vine Street, and it went past the lamp and hit the wall and knocked down the tintype of my mother, and glass went all over the floor where Bertie had been sitting 40 minutes before. That is when I stopped being a woman who had made a mistake and started being something else. I did not know it yet, but that rock is the line, and everything after it happened to a different person. Rand came home at 10 that night from my father's, where he had gone with a broom and a piece of oilcloth for the window. He stood in the kitchen doorway with the cold still on him. He had not said 6 words to me since noon. "Did you count it?" he said. "Yes." He nodded slowly, once, and hung his coat on the nail, and went to the sink and washed his hands a long time. Now, there are men who would have shouted. There are men who would have said, "What in God's name possessed you?" or, "You have ruined me." And to tell you the truth, I would have taken it. I was starved for somebody to say it out loud so it would be said and done. What Rand Vance did was wash his hands and dry them on the roller towel and sit down at the table and look at the oilcloth for about a minute. Then he said, "You'd have told me if you'd known." "Rand, that's all I've got to work out," he said. "Whether my wife knew. I've worked it out. Now let's go to bed, because they'll come for me tomorrow, and I'd as soon be rested." You can live a long time on one sentence. I have. They came for him Thursday, and it was not a dramatic thing, which somehow made it more terrible. The sheriff, whose name was Tobias Reddick, and who had known Rand since they were boys on the same ball field, came to the elevator at the noon whistle and let him finish the load he was on. Rand walked out with him in front of 30 men in the scale house and did not put his hat on until they were outside. There was no bail money, and there was no bail set that week anyway, and the county attorney, a careful, ambitious young man named Ansel Roop, filed his information on the following Monday and set the preliminary hearing for the first Monday in April, which was the 4th. 31 days. The Sentinel came out Thursday afternoon. It ran the closing on the front page, and beside it a piece that named the association's balance and named the account in Ottumwa and named my husband, and beside that, in the same column and the same type, it named the counting teller. Corliss read that paper on Thursday night, and Corliss made up its mind on Friday. And by Saturday, I could not buy meal at Dorner's without the room going quiet. Bertie came home Monday with her stockings torn at both knees and would not say who. On Wednesday, Eula Sharp, 79 years old, who had buried 2 husbands out of that association, stood on my father's walk and screamed at his front door for 4 minutes about her burial money, while my father stood behind the mended window and could not hear one word of it, only see her mouth. You are waiting for me to tell you what I did. For 8 days, I did nothing. I want to be honest with you, because there is no use telling this if I am going to make myself the kind of woman who squares her shoulders on the second morning. For 8 days, I sat in that house with the shades down. I answered the door to nobody. I made meals I do not remember making. I went over it and over it. The shades going down in the wrong order. The bolt on the frosted door. The beat too long when I asked him if the door was still on its hinges, and every time I came around to the same place, which was that I had counted it out with my own hands and signed my whole name, and that a jury of Corliss men, if it came to it, would ask themselves one question. How does a bank president rob a burial fund without his teller in it with him? What broke it was Wendell Prine. I went to Vantage on the 8th of March on the morning train because his sister's husband kept the harness shop there, and Wendell had been sitting in their back room for a week. She did not want to let me in. I stood on that porch in the wind and said, through the screen, that I would stand there until dark, and that the neighbors could watch me do it. And she let me in. He was at the kitchen table in his shirt sleeves with his collar off, and he had not shaved. And Wendell Prine, unshaven, was like seeing a church with its doors open at midnight. "You've no business here," he said. "He sent you home at 3. He sent me home at 3. He turned his cup around. And I went. Why? Because I have worked for that man 11 years, and I know what it means when he tells me to go home at 3. He looked up at me and his eyes were red-rimmed and hating. And I understood that most of what he hated was himself, and that I was standing in for it. You want me to say I knew. I did not know. I suspected, which is worse. And I went home and I sat by my stove and I let it happen to you because it was you and not me. Then say that to the examiner and be indicted with him? No, ma'am. They've got my husband in the county jail. I know what they've got. His hand was shaking on the cup and he put it down. Mrs. Vance, I'll give you one thing because I can give it to you in this kitchen and swear to none of it. Junius Lofton did not rob that fund on the 29th of February. That fund has been gone for 2 years. The kitchen clock ticked. His sister stood in the doorway with a dish towel in her hands and did not move. Say that again. In the spring of 1930, the bank lent out the association's deposit, he said. All of it, near enough. Lumber inventory and 2 farm mortgages, one of them for Tandy's. And Tandy's has not paid $1 of principal since the fall of '31 and never will. Because there is no lumber in that yard. I have walked through it. The money was gone, Mrs. Vance. The book showed $8,400 because the book was made to show it. What went out your window on the 29th was not the fund. It was cash. The last cash in that building, going out the door in a satchel in a name that was not his, and the fund's hole got covered over by the same motion. And now every man in this county thinks the money that ruined them is sitting in Ottumwa in your husband's name instead of standing empty in a lumber yard 2 blocks from the Methodist church. I sat down. I had not been invited to. The 40 tickets, I said. The interest credits, said Wendell Prine. December quarter. Somebody had to write them so the book would run true to the audit. And it could not be Josiah, because Josiah's hand is in that book on every page since 1909, and the state has 40 years of it to compare. And it could not be me, because I was already refusing him things by December. He gave a laugh with nothing in it. So he found a hand nobody in Des Moines had ever seen. He praised your 4s. God forgive me. I heard him do it, and I went and got my coat. I got up. At the door I turned around, and I asked the only thing left. Wendell, who is Dorset? He is a man who opens accounts, said Wendell Prine. That is his whole trade. And he has a good overcoat, and he did not come to Corliss to see the president of a country bank about anything a country bank does. I rode back on the 4 o'clock. I remember the fields going by, all that black ground under old snow, and I remember that I did not cry, and that somewhere between Vantage and Corliss, the shaking stopped and did not come back for years. Here is what I understood by the time the train slowed at our water tank. They had not chosen me because I was a fool. They had chosen me because I was the most respectable-looking pen in that county. The deaf drayman's girl who got the job on merit and lined up her stamps in a row. And they had chosen Rand because he was hard of hearing and in debt $50 and could be made to look like a man who had reached for something. Everything that had been done to us had been done because we were exactly the sort of people a town believes about and does not believe. Well, I was still the best pen in the county, and I had learned my figures from Orrin Pike, and Orrin Pike lived on Grove Street, and I went there that night. He opened the door in his cardigan with the copper wire on his spectacles, and he looked at me, and his whole face came apart. Hattie, I want the minute book, I said. He let me in. His house smelled like camphor and cold ashes.
There was a plate of something dried on the arm of the chair. He sat down and took the spectacles off and held them in both hands, and he told me. And it took him half an hour, and he never once looked at me. In the spring of 1930, Junius Lofton had come to him with a proposition. The association's money was drawing 2%, and Lofton could get it 4% if it were placed as time deposits and loans through the bank's discretion. And he needed only a standing consent from the treasurer, so it would not have to be voted every quarter. Orrin Pike, who had 806 members' quarters to look after and a bad chest and no help, signed a letter. He signed it in blank as to particulars because Lofton said the particulars would change with the market, and because Junius Lofton had carried a corner of the Hodel boy's casket and paid for the parsonage roof. On the 11th of February, he said, I asked to see the card because I had heard a thing about the Tandy note, and he opened the drawer and showed me my own letter with the particulars filled in another man's writing, and it said what it said, and my name was at the bottom of it in my own hand, and there is no living way for me to prove I did not write the top of that page. He put the spectacles back on. I have not slept 11 days. Hattie, I'm going to say a thing to you now, and you will hate me for it, and I'm going to say it anyway because I have thought it out. If I go to the county attorney and say that letter was signed in blank, they will hang the whole of it on an old man's carelessness, and that is what I deserve. But they will also ask who wrote the December interest credits, and the answer to that is in your handwriting. And once that is in the record, you will not be a witness anymore. You will be a defendant, and your girl will grow up in a house with 2 of them. He wet his lips. There is another way. I will take it, all of it. I will say I directed the transfer, and that you did as you were told, and that Rand knew nothing. It puts me in the penitentiary, and it puts the fund in the ground. And Junius goes on being a man who was let down by his treasurer, and nobody ever looks at the lumberyard. But you and Rand walk out. The stove ticked. I thought about Bertie's stockings and about the tintype of my mother lying face down in the glass. No, I said. Hattie, you want to buy my silence with your own life? And you want to call it a kindness? My voice came out level, and it frightened me a little, because it was not the voice I had gone in there with. Mr. Pike, you already bought a piece of quiet once. In 1930, you signed a paper in blank so you wouldn't have to hold 400 meetings, and every man in Corliss is going to bury his wife on what that saved you. I will not have any part of the second one. He sat there. What do you want from me then? The minute book, I said. Every page from 1894. He got up without a word and went into the back room and came out with it, a great swollen thing with a marbled cover, and he put it in my arms, and I stood there in his front hall with 60 pounds of dead men's quarters against my chest. Article 9, said Orrin Pike quietly. I have read it 400 times in 11 days. No withdrawal of the fund shall be made upon the signature of the treasurer alone, but shall bear also the signature of the president of the association, and be recorded in these minutes at the next stated meeting. He looked at me for the first time. That letter has one name on it. There is no minute. It is not worth the paper, Hattie. It never was. And Junius Lofton knew it when he wrote it, and he did not care, because he never meant that letter to be tested in a courtroom. He meant it to be found in a drawer by a jury that would look at it and stop looking. I walked home with the book. My arms ached for 2 days. That is when the cold calm came, and I will tell you exactly what it felt like.
because people talk about it as if it were courage, and it is not. It is arithmetic. It is the moment you stop asking whether the thing can be fixed and start asking what it would take. It came on me on Grove Street between the Methodist church and the corner, under a streetlight, with my breath going up white, and what came with it was a list. The letter needed a second signature and had none. That was the paper. The account in Ottumwa was opened on the 29th in the afternoon, 61 miles away, while Rand was on the elevator floor. That was the clock. The elevator kept a scale book, and every load that came over that scale had the weigher's initials and the time. And Rand Vance's initials were on that book in ink 4 times on the 29th of February, between 1 o'clock and 4:30. That was the alibi. And it was written by his own hand in a book the elevator company would not let out of the office for love nor money. The deposit was made in Ottumwa on the morning of the 1st of March by a man who signed a card at a counter, and there had been a girl or a man behind that counter who watched him do it. That was the witness. And Josiah Fenn had kept carbon copies of drafts in a shoebox for 11 years because he did not trust the man he worked for. That was the proof of the December credits and the cramped December hand they were supposedly copied from. I stood under that streetlight and I counted it out the way I counted a drawer. 4 things. 30 days. One of them was in a locked office at the elevator. One was 61 miles away in a bank that had every reason to say nothing. One was in the hands of an old man who had spent 11 years being afraid. And one I already had in my arms. I went home and I lit the lamp, and I got out a sheet of the bank's own ruled paper, and at the top of it I wrote the date, and under that I wrote, "Things to be proved," and under that I wrote the 4 of them in a numbered column in the roundest, plainest hand I own. Then I sat back and looked at my own writing on the page, and for the first time in 12 days, it did not look like the thing that had ruined us. It looked like a tool. Josiah Fenn was the easiest and the hardest. I went to his rooms above the tailor's on a Sunday, and he had the shoebox on the table before I had my coat off, which told me he had been waiting for somebody to come and ask, and that he had been sitting up there for 2 weeks, afraid that nobody would. There were 11 years of flimsy carbons in it, tied in bundles with grocery string, and in the bundle for December of 1931 were the original interest credits for the Burial Association, in a cramped, crowded, back-slanted hand. "That's Junius," he said. "That's his own writing, and it's dated the 31st of December. And there is not one thing wrong with those tickets, Hattie. The figures are right. They were right when he wrote them, and they were right when you copied them." He put his old finger on the top one. That's what he wanted. He didn't want a false ticket. He wanted a true ticket in a new hand, so that when the state pulled that funds file, every paper in it from December forward would be written by the woman who signed the transfer. It builds a person out of paper. It builds her out of nothing but the truth, told in the wrong order. I asked him if he would say that to the examiner, and to the county attorney, and in a courtroom. The old man looked at his coffee going cold on the corner of the table, the way it had gone cold on his blotter for 40 years. "I should have said it in 1929, he said. "Yes, I'll say it." The scale book took 11 days, and a lie I am not ashamed of. The elevator's manager would not let that book out of his office and would not let me look at it because the company's lawyer in Cedar Rapids had told him not to become involved in a criminal matter. So I wrote to the company's lawyer in Cedar Rapids myself, on the bank's own ruled paper in my roundest hand, and I did not ask him for the book. I asked him whether, in the event the county attorney subpoenaed the weigh records for the 29th of February, the company would be able to certify the entries as having been made in the ordinary course of business by the weigher whose initials appeared on them. A lawyer cannot resist telling you what he is prepared to certify.
He wrote back in 4 days and said that the company would so certify, and he sent the county attorney a copy of his own letter, which is exactly what I had hoped he would do. And that is how Ansel Roop came to have in his hand, without ever asking me for it, a certified record that put Rand Vance's initials on the Corliss scale at 110, 240, 355, and 420 in the afternoon of the 29th of February. 4:20. The same minute the ticket was stamped in my cage. Ottumwa I did on the 6th of March and again on the 19th. The first time I got nothing. I went to the Second National with the minute book in a flour sack and asked to see an officer, and a young man in a gray suit told me pleasantly that the bank could not discuss an account with a person who was not the depositor, and that the matter was in the hands of the authorities, and that he was sorry, ma'am, and he was not. I went out and stood on the sidewalk. It was raining, that fine, cold rain that gets inside your collar. And because I had been a teller for 5 years, I did a thing that only a teller would think to do. Instead of going home, I went across the street to the Ottumwa Public Library, and I sat down with the city directory and the newspaper for the first week of March. Banks advertise. They cannot help it. On the 2nd of March, the Second National had run a 2-column advertisement in the Ottumwa Courier with a photograph of their new lobby, and standing at the 3rd window in that photograph, in her white blouse, with her name printed under it in the caption because the bank was proud of her, was Miss Sylvie Mott, teller. I found her house on the 19th. She was 22 years old and she lived with her mother, and when I told her who I was, her hand came up to her mouth. "I've been sick about it," she said. "I've been sick about it since the papers." She had opened the account. On the 29th of February, 20 minutes before closing, a man had come to her window with a card. She remembered him because he tipped her $1, which nobody does at a bank, and because when he smiled, there was gold up on the left side. "He gave the name Vance," she said. "He signed it, and he said his wife would be in with the deposit in the morning." His wife. "But you didn't come in," said Sylvie Mott. "He did. The next morning, 9 o'clock, first through the door, with a satchel. And I said, 'Good morning, Mr. Vance. Is your wife not well?' And he said—" She stopped and got red. "Say it." "He said, 'She's counting.'" I sat in that front room in Ottumwa with my hands folded on the flour sack, and I let that go all the way through me, every inch, and I did not make a sound. Then I said, "Miss Mott, would you write down what you have just told me and sign it and let your mother witness it?" She did. She wrote it out on tablet paper in a schoolgirl hand, and she signed it, and her mother signed under it, and then Sylvie Mott said the thing that finished it. "There's the card, too," she said. "He signed the signature card at my window, and I made him do it twice because the first one strayed off the line, and I put the spoiled one in the drawer instead of the basket because our rule is that spoiled cards go to the officers on Friday." She looked up. "It's still in my drawer. I never took it up. I forgot it clean until the papers." 2 signature cards, in the name of Rand Vance, in the same strange hand, one of them never entered anywhere, sitting in a teller's drawer 61 miles from a man who at that hour had been in a county jail cell for 4 days. I got home on the last train. Rand had been in that cell 22 days by then, and I had been to see him twice a week, and we mostly talked about Birdie. And once he asked me whether the lilac at my father's had budded, and I said not yet. The night of the 3rd of April, I did not go to bed at all. I sat at the kitchen table with the lamp turned low,
and I laid it all out in front of me in the order I would need it. The way I used to lay out a drawer. The minute book open flat at Article 9 with a strip of newspaper marking it. The letter of instruction which Hollis Crane had photographed for the state and given me a copy of. The certified letter from the company lawyer in Cedar Rapids. The December carbons in their grocery string. Sylvie Mott's tablet paper with 2 signatures and her mother's under it. And on the top of the stack, the ticket. My whole name in my round hand. The house made its night sounds. The stove clicked.
Somewhere out past the fairgrounds, a freight went through and blew for the crossing, that long, doubled note that is the loneliest sound God ever let a man invent. I thought about all of it. I thought about how sure I had been that a president who let you copy his tickets after hours had let you inside a door. I thought about my father buttoning his coat over that green passbook, and along about 4 in the morning, I got up and looked at myself in the little mirror by the door. And I was 27, and I looked 40. And I said out loud to nobody, "You counted it. Now count it back." Then I washed my face, and I put on my mother's gray wool, and at 8 o'clock I walked down Sycamore in the light with a flour sack in my arms. They held the depositors' meeting in the school gymnasium because there was no other room in the county that would take them all, and by 10 o'clock on the 4th of April, there were 400 and some people in it, on the bleachers and standing 3 deep along the wall under the basketball hoop, in their church clothes, which is what a farm town wears to a hanging or a funeral or the end of its savings. There was a table at the free throw line with a pitcher of water on it. Hollis Crane stood at one end of that table with the receiver's papers, and Ansel Roop, the county attorney, sat at the other, and Tobias Reddick stood by the door with his hat off. And in the second row, in a good gray overcoat, with a lawyer from Des Moines beside him, sat Junius Lofton. He had come back on the 30th of March of his own accord, which is the thing you must understand about a man like that. He had not run to Canada. He had gone to Chicago on the sleeper and stayed 11 days at a hotel and come home on the train in daylight with his hat on, and the Sentinel had printed that the president had returned to assist the superintendent. And half that town believed it, because the paper record in that bank pointed like a weather vane at an elevator man and his wife, and he had built it that way in front of me with a cup of coffee in his hand. He nodded to me when I came in with the flour sack. A grave, kind, sorrowing nod. The nod you give a woman at a graveside. Crane read the receiver's statement first. The bank's assets would not cover 40 cents on the dollar. Then he came to the association, and the room got so quiet you could hear the furnace. "Mrs. Vance," he said, "will you come up, please?" I came up. 400 people watched me walk the length of that floor, and my father was on the 3rd row of the bleachers with his hat in his hands. Crane laid the ticket on the table and turned it toward the room. "Is that your signature?" "It is." Somebody in the back said something and somebody else shushed it, and it went through the room like wind over a field. "Did you count out $8,400 on the afternoon of the 29th of February and hand it to Junius Lofton?" "I did," I said. "He told me it was the burial fund and that it was going to a correspondent house for safekeeping. I believed him. I have been a fool in front of this whole town, and I am not going to stand here and be anything else. But before you decide what I am, Mr. Crane, I would like to hand you 5 things, and I would like you to read them out loud, because I cannot make 400 people take my word, and I do not ask them to." Crane looked at Ansel Roop. Roop looked at me a long moment, and then he said, "Read them." I gave him the minute book first, open at Article 9, and he read it to the room in a flat voice. "No withdrawal upon the signature of the treasurer alone. A second signature required. A minute required.
Then he read the letter of instruction, which had one signature and no minute, and he set the two side by side on the table and said, "As a matter of law, this instrument is a nullity. It authorized nothing." Lofton's lawyer stood up. Crane told him to sit down, and he sat down. I gave him the certified letter from Cedar Rapids, and he read out the 4 times from the elevator scale book. And when he read 4:20 in the afternoon of the 29th of February, a man's voice from the wall said, "That's right, I was behind him on the scale." And Tobias Reddick did not even turn his hand. Then I said, "Miss Mott." She came down out of the bleachers in her white blouse with her mother behind her, 22 years old, 61 miles from home. And she told them about a man with a gold tooth who signed a card at her window before 3 o'clock on the 29th and tipped her $1. She told them that he came back at 9 the next morning with a satchel. She told them what he said when she asked after his wife. He said, "She's counting." I had not warned the room, and I had not warned myself. And hearing it out loud in that gymnasium took the strength out of my knees for a second, and I put my hand on the table. Then she took out of her pocketbook the spoiled signature card that had lain in her drawer since the 29th of February, and gave it to Hollis Crane. And Ansel Roop got up and came and stood over it, and the two of them looked at that card, and then at the ticket with my name on it, and then, both at once, at the second row. Josiah Finn came next with the shoebox and 11 years of grocery string. He was 68 years old, and his voice shook the whole time, and he did not stop. "That's the December interest, in Junius Lofton's own hand," he said. "He wrote it true. And then he had that girl copy it out fresh at night, and he told her it was for the examiner's eyes. It was not. It was so that when the state opened that fund's file, every paper in it would be in a woman's handwriting that nobody in Des Moines had ever seen before." He put the bundle down. "And I want it in this record that I knew what he was in 1929, and I kept my mouth shut and drew my wages. And there are men in this room who are going to be buried by the county on account of it." Then Hollis Crane said the thing I had not brought and could not have brought, because the state had gone where I could not go. "On the 28th of March, he said, on my requisition, the superintendent's office examined the inventory of the Tandy Lumber Company against the schedules pledged to this bank. The yard is pledged for $11,000. There is not $400 of merchantable lumber standing in it. It has not been a lumber yard since the fall of 1930. Foy Tandy was on the front row. He got up and went out, and the whole room turned and watched him go, and nobody said one word to him, and that was worse than if they had. Junius Lofton stood up. He was still at that moment the best-dressed man in the room, and he had his voice, that warm platform voice, and he used it. "Mr. Crane, friends, I have known most of you 30 years. This has been a hard spring, and there is a great deal of hurt in this room, looking for somewhere to go. Mrs. Vance has had a shock, and she is young, and she has a husband in trouble, and I do not hold one word of it against her. Mr. Lofton." He stopped. I had not raised my voice. That is the whole reason it carried. You told me on my first week in that building that a bank is not money. You said a bank is the belief that the money is here, and that I was in the belief business. I picked the ticket up off the table and held it so the room could see it. You spent the belief first. Then you spent the money. Then you spent me and my husband and Mr. Pike, and you did it with our own honest handwriting because we were the only people in this county nobody would ever check." The furnace ticked. $8,400, I said. You told me to take my time about it. I have taken my time about it for 5 weeks, Mr. Lofton, and I have counted it back, and every dollar of it comes out standing in front of you." He opened his mouth, and Eula Sharp, 79 years old, who had screamed at my father's mended window about her burial money, stood up in the 4th row of the bleachers with her handbag against her chest and said loud and cracked, "Sit down, Junius." And he sat down. In front of 400 people, he sat down. I have never seen anything take a man's standing from him so fast, before or since. Ansel Roop dismissed the information against Rand Vance at 11:40 that morning, and Tobias Reddick brought him from the jail in his own car, and Rand walked into that gymnasium in his work clothes because he had nothing else there, and my father got up off the bleachers and shook his hand for a long time without saying anything at all. The rest of it belongs in a paragraph, the way the rest of it always does. Junius Lofton was indicted in May on 9 counts, and the account in Ottumwa had been frozen since the 1st of March, so 6,800 of the fund came home, and the receiver got 1,100 more out of the sale of his house on Prospect Street. Wendell Prine testified under immunity and never worked in a bank again. He sells insurance in Council Bluffs, and I am told he is good at it. The man Dorset was arrested in Rock Island in July with a good overcoat and 3 other names. Lofton got 5 to 10 at Fort Madison and served 6 years and 4 months. And when he came out, he did not come back to Corliss. And I am glad, because there was a period of about 2 years when I do not know what some of those men would have done. The mirror of it, which I did not plan and could not have arranged, was this. When the receiver held the sale of his household goods on the courthouse steps in Vantage in the fall of 1932, the association bought his roll-top desk for $4 and put it in the hall over the harness shop. And that is the desk their books have been kept on ever since. They have been kept by me. They voted it in June, in that same gymnasium, and Eula Sharp made the motion. The association reorganized, and it took the association 4 years to come whole, and it did come whole, and there was not a family in Corliss that went into the potter's field. I did the collecting and the posting for $9 a month, and after 1935, when the new mutual opened in the old brick front on Sycamore, I did it in the evenings, because in the daytime I was at the second window, and then the first, and after the war, I was the cashier, and I was the first woman in that county to be one. Rand went back to the elevator on the 6th of April, 1932, and worked there 29 more years. He never once in all that time said anything to me about the 29th of February. Not one word, not in an argument, not at Christmas, not the year we nearly lost the house anyway on account of his back. I asked him about it exactly once, when we were old, and he thought about it in his slow way and said, "You'd have told me if you'd known. That was all I had to work out." Then he went out to see about the tomatoes. My father lived to 1941. The receiver paid the general depositors 38 cents on the dollar over 5 years, so his $900 and some came back to him as $342, and he did not buy the piece out past the fairgrounds, and he never said a bitter word about it in my hearing. When he died, I found the passbook in the inside pocket of his good coat, buttoned over, with the last line in my own round hand, and I have it yet. It is not worth a dime and never will be. It is the most valuable thing I own. Orrin Pike gave up the treasurership in June and asked to be allowed to collect the quarters instead, on foot, for nothing. And he did it for 6 years in all weather until his chest finished him in 1938. 400 people came. The association buried him out of its own fund, and there is a stone, and I chose what is on it, and it says his name and his dates and the words, "He taught us to figure." And every soul in that town knew exactly what that meant, and not one of them ever asked me about it. And this is the part I think about now, at my age, in the mornings. At the Mutual, my window was the first one inside the door, and there was a shade on the front glass, the kind on a cord with a wooden pull. Every working morning for 26 years, I came in at 8:30, and I lined up my stamps in a row until the edges made one straight line, and at 9:05, I raised that shade myself. Nobody else ever touched it. Not once did I let anybody else touch it, and in 26 years, nobody ever asked me why. A bank is the belief that the money is here. He was right about that, and it was the only true thing he ever told me. What he did not know is that the belief does not live in the vault door, and it does not live in a good gray overcoat, and it does not live in a name that a town has been saying respectfully for 30 years. It lives in whoever is willing to stand at the window in the morning and raise the shade and the light in the right order where everyone can see. Well, friends, that is where the story leaves us. And I have a question for you. If Junius Lofton had told her the truth that afternoon, "The fund is gone. It has been gone 2 years. Help me hide it and I will keep you and yours," do you believe she would have said no? She has believed all her life that she would have. But she stood in that gymnasium and told 400 people she had been a fool once, and she has never been quite sure she was not being one twice. Tell me what you think in the comments. I read every one. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end of this one. There should be a playlist coming up on your screen with other stories from this channel, and I would love for you to stay a while longer.